Christmas morning 2023. While my sister Emma unwrapped a trust fund worth $500,000, I was in my bedroom printing eviction papers. The same man who had just made her dreams come true was about to lose everything I'd worked for. His name was Derek Mitchell, and he had no idea what was coming. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. 3 years earlier, I thought I'd found my Prince Charming. Derek Mitchell walked into the coffee shop where I worked part-time during my final semester at Northwestern University, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit and carrying himself like he owned the world. He ordered a simple black coffee but left a $20 tip on a $3 drink. When he asked for my number, I thought it was the most romantic gesture I'd ever experienced. Derek was everything I thought I wanted. 28 years old, 6 feet tall with dark hair and striking green eyes, working as a financial advisor at a prestigious firm in downtown Chicago. He drove a BMW, lived in a high-rise apartment in River North, and talked about investment portfolios the way other people discussed the weather. On our first date, he took me to Alinea, the kind of restaurant I'd only read about in magazines. I wore my best dress, a simple black number from Target, and felt completely out of place among the crystal and gold-rimmed plates. Within 6 months, we were inseparable. Derek showered me with gifts I'd never imagined owning: designer handbags, jewelry from Tiffany, weekend trips to New York and San Francisco. He paid for everything without blinking, waving away my protests with a charming smile and insisting that spoiling me made him happy. Coming from a middle-class family in suburban Milwaukee, where my father worked as a high school teacher and my mother as a nurse, this lifestyle felt like stepping into a fairy tale. The proposal came exactly 1 year after we met, at the same coffee shop where we'd first encountered each other. Derek had arranged for the entire place to be decorated with white roses and fairy lights. He got down on one knee in front of a crowd of strangers and presented me with a diamond ring that caught the light like captured starfire. The ring alone probably cost more than my parents made in 3 months. I said yes through tears of joy, convinced I was the luckiest woman alive. We moved in together immediately after the engagement, into Derek's apartment that overlooked Lake Michigan. The place was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble countertops, and furniture that looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine. I contributed my small savings account and the few pieces of furniture I'd accumulated during college, but everything else was his. Derek insisted on handling all the finances, setting up automatic payments for everything from utilities to groceries. He said it would be simpler that way, and I trusted him completely. The wedding planning began immediately. Derek wanted everything to be perfect, which apparently meant everything had to be expensive. The venue he selected cost $40,000 just for the space rental. The flowers alone were budgeted at $8,000. When I suggested we could save money by having a smaller celebration, Derek looked genuinely confused. He explained that this wedding would be a reflection of our future together, and he wanted everyone to see how successful we were as a couple. My parents tried to contribute what they could, but Derek politely declined their offers. He said he wanted them to simply enjoy the day without worrying about expenses. At the time, I thought this was incredibly generous. Looking back, I realize it was the beginning of a pattern that would define our entire relationship. Derek controlling every financial decision, while making it seem like thoughtfulness. The wedding itself was everything Derek had envisioned. 200 guests at the Palmer House Hilton, a 7-course dinner with wine pairings, and a live band that had played at celebrity weddings. I felt like a princess in my custom-designed gown, dancing with my new husband while surrounded by luxury I'd never imagined experiencing. Emma, my younger sister by 3 years, served as my maid of honor, beaming with happiness for my good fortune. Emma had always been the dreamer in our family. While I focused on practical things like getting good grades and finding stable employment, she pursued her passion for art and design. She'd graduated with a degree in fine arts, but struggled to find steady work in her field. At 22, she was still living with our parents, working part-time at a local gallery and trying to establish herself as a freelance graphic designer. Derek seemed genuinely fond of her from the beginning, often asking about her projects and encouraging her artistic pursuits. The first year of marriage felt like an extended honeymoon. Derek and I traveled frequently for his work, staying in 5-star hotels and dining at restaurants I'd previously only seen on travel shows. He bought me a new wardrobe suitable for his business functions, explaining that appearance was crucial in his industry. I left my part-time job at the coffee shop, and Derek encouraged me to take time to figure out what I really wanted to do with my career. The pressure was off, he said. I could pursue my passions without worrying about immediate income. This arrangement seemed perfect until I started noticing subtle changes in Derek's behavior. He began making comments about my spending, even though I barely bought anything for myself beyond basic necessities. When I suggested going back to school for my master's degree, he questioned whether it was a wise investment. He started reviewing our credit card statements together each month, going through every purchase and asking me to justify expenses I'd made. The control became more apparent when I tried to access our joint savings account to buy a birthday gift for my mother. Derek had moved my money into this account after we married, claiming it would earn better interest than my old savings account. When I attempted to make the withdrawal, I discovered he'd set up the account so that both signatures were required for any transactions over $50. He explained this was a security measure to protect us from fraud, but something about his explanation felt rehearsed. Emma started visiting us more frequently during this period, often staying for dinner or weekend visits. Derek seemed to enjoy her company, engaging her in long conversations about art and creativity. He began offering to help with her career, connecting her with potential clients through his business network. When she landed her first major freelance project designing marketing materials for a luxury hotel chain, Derek took credit for making the introduction. Emma was grateful, but I noticed she seemed slightly uncomfortable with how much involvement Derek wanted in her professional life. The dynamic in our household shifted gradually. Derek began working longer hours, often coming home late from client meetings or business dinners. When I asked to accompany him to these events, he explained that they were boring work functions where I'd feel out of place. He said he preferred keeping his professional and personal lives separate, which seemed reasonable at the time. I filled my evenings with reading, cooking elaborate meals Derek rarely had time to eat, and video calling with Emma or my parents. Money became an increasingly frequent topic of conversation. Derek would praise me for being frugal, then question purchases I considered necessary. When the coffee maker broke and I replaced it with a similar model, he suggested I should have consulted him first since it was a significant expense. The coffee maker cost $68. He made more than that in a single hour of work. Emma's career began flourishing partly due to Derek's connections, but also because of her genuine talent and dedication. She started earning enough money to move out of our parents' house and into a small apartment in Milwaukee. Derek celebrated this milestone by taking us all out to dinner at an upscale restaurant, where he gave a toast about family success and supporting each other's dreams. He seemed genuinely proud of Emma's accomplishments, and I felt grateful to have married someone who cared so much about my family. The second year of our marriage brought new challenges. Derek's firm was expanding, and he was promoted to senior financial advisor with a substantial salary increase. This should have been a cause for celebration, but instead, Derek became more stressed and demanding about household expenses. He implemented a monthly budget meeting, where we'd review every expenditure and plan for the following month. These meetings felt less like collaborative financial planning and more like performance reviews, where I had to justify my existence. During one of these budget sessions, Derek announced that he'd been thinking about our long-term financial strategy. He wanted to start investing more aggressively in real estate, specifically purchasing rental properties that could generate passive income. This sounded like a smart plan, and I supported the idea enthusiastically. What I didn't realize was that Derek intended to use my inheritance money as the down payment for these investments. My grandmother had passed away 6 months after our wedding, leaving me a modest inheritance of $35,000. The money was sitting in a separate account that Derek hadn't yet consolidated with our other finances. When he proposed using this inheritance for real estate investments, he presented it as an opportunity for us to build wealth together. The properties would be owned jointly, he assured me, and the rental income would benefit both of us. I agreed, trusting that Derek's financial expertise would help us create a secure future. Within 3 months, Derek had purchased 2 small rental properties in up-and-coming neighborhoods on Chicago's South Side. The paperwork was complex, filled with legal terms I didn't fully understand. Derek handled all the arrangements, explaining that his experience in finance made him better equipped to navigate the legal requirements. I signed where he indicated, assuming everything was being set up exactly as we'd discussed. The rental properties required significant renovations before they could be occupied by tenants. Derek managed these projects personally, hiring contractors and overseeing the work during his free time. He seemed energized by this new venture, spending weekends at the properties and coming home covered in dust but excited about the progress. I admired his dedication and felt proud that we were building something substantial together. Emma's relationship with Derek continued to strengthen during this period. She often helped with design decisions for the rental properties, offering her artistic expertise to create appealing spaces for potential tenants. Derek valued her input and began paying her small fees for her consulting work on these projects. This arrangement seemed to benefit everyone. Emma earned extra income doing work she enjoyed, Derek got professional design assistance, and I felt happy seeing two important people in my life collaborating successfully. As Christmas 2022 approached, Derek surprised me by suggesting we host a large holiday gathering at our apartment. He wanted to invite both our families, plus some of his colleagues and their spouses. This would be our first time entertaining on such a scale, and Derek insisted on making it an elegant affair. He hired a catering company, bought expensive wine, and decorated our apartment like a winter wonderland. The party was beautiful and seemingly successful, but I noticed Derek spent most of the evening networking with his colleagues rather than celebrating with family. That Christmas morning, Derek gave me a stunning diamond tennis bracelet that matched my engagement ring. Emma received a high-end digital drawing tablet that would significantly improve her design work. My parents got a weekend getaway package to a luxury resort. Derek's generosity seemed boundless, and everyone praised him for his thoughtfulness and success. I felt grateful to be married to someone who could provide such wonderful experiences for the people I loved most. The new year brought unexpected challenges that would test the foundation of everything I thought I knew about my marriage and my husband's character. The first red flag appeared in February 2023, hidden inside what seemed like good news. Derek announced that our rental properties were performing better than expected, generating enough income to consider expanding our real estate portfolio. He showed me spreadsheets filled with numbers that looked impressive, though I couldn't verify their accuracy since he managed all the tenant relationships and financial records personally. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. What struck me as odd was Derek's suggestion that we celebrate this success by taking Emma on a vacation to Hawaii. He claimed she'd been working too hard on her freelance projects and deserved a break. While I appreciated his thoughtfulness toward my sister, the timing felt strange. We'd never taken a family vacation that included just Emma, and Derek usually preferred our trips to be romantic getaways for two. The Hawaii trip was everything Derek promised it would be. We stayed at a luxury resort on Maui, where Emma had her own ocean view suite and unlimited access to the spa and resort activities. Derek paid for everything without hesitation, including Emma's expensive shopping excursions and her decision to try every water sport the resort offered. He seemed genuinely happy watching Emma enjoy herself, taking photos of her parasailing and jet skiing like a proud older brother. During one evening at the resort's high-end restaurant, Derek surprised Emma by presenting her with an envelope containing $5,000 in cash. He said it was a bonus for all her design work on our rental properties, plus seed money to help her start her own graphic design business. Emma was overwhelmed with gratitude, tears streaming down her face as she hugged Derek and thanked him repeatedly. I felt proud of my husband's generosity, though something nagged at me about the casual way he carried around such a large amount of cash. Emma used Derek's gift to establish her own design studio, renting a small office space in Milwaukee's trendy Third Ward district. Derek helped her set up the business paperwork, connecting her with his accountant and lawyer to ensure everything was structured properly. He even co-signed her business loan application, explaining that her credit history wasn't extensive enough to qualify for the best interest rates on her own. Emma was building something real, and Derek seemed genuinely invested in her success. Meanwhile, my own life was becoming increasingly constrained. Derek had implemented new household rules, disguised as efficiency measures. All packages delivered to our apartment had to be opened in his presence so he could review the contents and receipts. Grocery shopping required a pre-approved list, and any deviations had to be justified during our monthly budget meetings. When I questioned these restrictions, Derek explained that financial discipline was essential for achieving our long-term goals. The isolation crept in gradually. Derek began declining social invitations on our behalf, claiming he was too busy with work and our real estate investments to maintain an active social calendar. When my college friends organized a reunion dinner, Derek suggested I skip it since we were trying to reduce unnecessary expenses. When my parents invited us for Sunday dinners, Derek often had urgent business matters that required his attention. I found myself spending more time alone in our beautiful apartment, feeling like a prisoner in a gilded cage. Emma, conversely, was thriving. Her design business attracted high-profile clients, and she began earning more money than she'd ever imagined possible. Derek took credit for mentoring her success, often saying he'd recognized her potential from the beginning. Emma seemed grateful for his guidance, frequently asking his advice about business decisions and client relationships. Their conversations during family gatherings increasingly focused on business strategy and financial planning, topics that made me feel excluded from their growing professional relationship. The truth about our rental properties began unraveling in late spring. I'd been curious about visiting the properties to see the renovations Derek had overseen, but he always had reasons why the timing wasn't convenient. Either the tenants were having issues that required his immediate attention, or contractors were working on maintenance projects that would make the properties unsafe for visitors. When I persisted, Derek finally agreed to drive me to see one of the buildings. The property was not what I'd expected. Located in a neighborhood that showed no signs of the gentrification Derek had described, the building looked neglected and poorly maintained. The few visible tenants appeared to be struggling financially, and the surrounding area had multiple vacant storefronts and abandoned lots. When I asked Derek about the discrepancy between this reality and his glowing financial reports, he explained that real estate investment required patience, and that the neighborhood's transformation would take time. Something in Derek's explanation didn't ring true, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what felt wrong. That evening, I attempted to access our joint accounts online to review the rental income Derek had been reporting. I discovered that he'd changed all the passwords without informing me, and my access to our financial information had been completely restricted. When I confronted him about this, Derek became defensive, claiming that cybersecurity was a serious concern and that consolidating account access under his credentials was safer for both of us. The cybersecurity explanation might have been believable if Derek hadn't simultaneously become secretive about his work activities. He started receiving frequent phone calls that he'd take in private, stepping into our bedroom or out onto the balcony to conduct conversations I wasn't allowed to hear. His laptop, which had previously been left open around the apartment, was now password protected and never left unattended. When I asked about his increased privacy measures, Derek said his firm was handling sensitive client information that required strict confidentiality protocols. Emma's business continued flourishing throughout the summer, landing contracts with major corporations and expanding her services to include web design and brand development. Derek celebrated each of her successes as if they were his own achievements, hosting dinner parties to announce her latest clients and praising her work ethic to anyone who would listen. He began referring to Emma as his protégé, claiming that her success validated his ability to recognize and develop talent. The dynamic between Derek and Emma began feeling uncomfortably close. They exchanged text messages throughout the day, sharing business ideas and inside jokes that I wasn't part of. Emma started calling Derek for advice before making any significant personal decisions, from apartment hunting to dating choices. When I mentioned that their relationship seemed unusually intimate for in-laws, Derek dismissed my concerns as jealousy over Emma's professional success. My suspicions about Derek's business dealings intensified when I accidentally overheard a phone conversation he was having with someone about property transfers and tax implications. The conversation included references to shell companies and offshore accounts, terms that didn't align with the straightforward real estate investment strategy Derek had described to me. When I asked him about what I'd heard, Derek claimed I'd misunderstood technical jargon related to legitimate business structures his firm used for client investments. The financial control Derek exercised over our household became increasingly oppressive as autumn approached. He implemented a new rule requiring me to photograph receipts for any purchase over $10, even for basic necessities like groceries or personal care items. My access to cash was limited to a weekly allowance that barely covered transportation and incidental expenses. When I pointed out that I was living like a teenager, dependent on parental approval, Derek accused me of being ungrateful for the comfortable lifestyle he provided. Emma's relationship with Derek took on an almost sibling-like quality that excluded me from many of their interactions. They developed shared interests in topics I knew nothing about, from wine collecting to contemporary art markets. Derek began taking Emma to business networking events as his guest, introducing her to potential clients and collaborators. When I asked why I wasn't invited to these same events, Derek explained that Emma's presence served a professional purpose while mine would be purely social. The holiday shopping season brought new revelations about Derek's spending patterns. While he continued restricting my access to money for basic expenses, he was simultaneously making large purchases that didn't appear on any statements I was allowed to see. Expensive wine deliveries arrived at our apartment almost daily. Derek's wardrobe expanded with custom suits and luxury accessories that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. When I questioned the disparity between his spending freedom and my restrictions, Derek said his purchases were business investments that would generate tax benefits and professional advantages. December arrived with Derek announcing plans for an elaborate Christmas celebration that would surpass the previous year's gathering. He wanted to invite even more people, including several of Emma's new business clients and some colleagues from his firm whom I'd never met. The guest list grew to over 50 people, requiring Derek to rent additional furniture and hire a full catering staff. The expense seemed excessive, but Derek insisted that hosting impressive events was essential for maintaining his professional reputation. Emma threw herself into helping plan the Christmas party, working with Derek to design elegant decorations and coordinate the catering menu. Their collaboration was seamless and efficient, as if they'd been planning events together for years. I felt like an observer in my own home, watching Derek and Emma create something beautiful, while my input was neither requested nor valued. The party planning consumed weeks of their time, with daily phone calls and meetings that I was subtly excluded from attending. As Christmas morning approached, Derek's behavior became increasingly erratic. He made several mysterious trips to the bank, returning with sealed envelopes he locked in his home office safe. He spent hours on encrypted phone calls, speaking in hushed tones about transactions and deadlines that seemed urgent. When I asked about his unusual activity, Derek claimed he was finalizing year-end business deals that would position us well for the following year. The night before Christmas, Derek presented me with an early gift, a beautiful jewelry box containing a note that read, "For all the patience you've shown while I built our future together." Inside the box was a stunning emerald necklace that must have cost thousands of dollars. The gift was gorgeous, but something about Derek's presentation felt like an apology for something I didn't yet understand. His smile seemed forced, and his hands trembled slightly as he fastened the necklace around my neck. That same evening, Derek handed Emma a large, wrapped box that he insisted she open immediately rather than waiting for Christmas morning. Inside was an expensive leather portfolio containing business documents that Derek said would, quote, change her life forever. Emma's reaction was intense gratitude, mixed with confusion, as if she understood the significance of the gift but couldn't quite believe it was real. Derek looked more nervous than generous as Emma examined the contents of the portfolio, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool apartment temperature. I went to bed that Christmas Eve feeling uneasy about the morning ahead, sensing that something significant was about to happen but unable to predict what form it would take. Christmas morning began with Derek acting like a man possessed by nervous energy. He was awake before dawn, pacing around our apartment and checking his phone constantly. When I found him in the kitchen at 6 a.m., fully dressed and drinking his third cup of coffee, he claimed he was excited about giving Emma her special gift. His explanation might have been convincing if his hands weren't shaking and his face wasn't pale with what looked like barely controlled panic. Emma arrived at 8 a.m., carrying presents for both of us and radiating the kind of happiness that comes from having a successful year behind you. She looked beautiful in a new designer dress that Derek had apparently helped her select, and her confidence was evident in every gesture. As we exchanged morning pleasantries, Derek kept glancing at his watch and toward the large wrapped box sitting under our Christmas tree like it contained something dangerous. The present exchange began normally enough. I gave Emma a handmade photo album documenting her business journey over the past year, filled with pictures of her design projects and accomplishments. She gave me a beautiful scarf she'd commissioned from a local artist, along with a heartfelt card about how proud she was of the woman I'd become. Derek received a vintage watch from Emma and a leather briefcase from me, gifts that seemed almost mundane compared to the tension radiating from his entire body. Then Derek announced it was time for Emma's real Christmas gift. He retrieved the large box from under the tree, handling it with the care usually reserved for fragile explosives. Emma's excitement was genuine as she tore away the wrapping paper, but her expression shifted to confusion when she revealed a plain cardboard file box sealed with tape. Derek's hands were visibly trembling as he handed her a letter opener and instructed her to be careful with the contents. Inside the box were legal documents, bank statements, and what appeared to be investment certificates. Emma spread the papers across our coffee table, her confusion deepening as she tried to make sense of what she was looking at. Derek sat beside her, his voice unnaturally high as he began explaining that he'd been secretly establishing a trust fund in her name over the past year. The documents showed that Emma was now the beneficiary of an account containing $500,000. Emma's reaction was exactly what Derek had hoped for. She screamed with joy, threw her arms around his neck, and sobbed tears of gratitude onto his shoulder. She kept repeating, "I can't believe this is real," while Derek patted her back and smiled with what looked more like relief than happiness. Watching this scene unfold, I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach that had nothing to do with Christmas morning excitement. The trust fund documentation was extensive and complex, filled with legal terminology that would have been difficult for anyone without financial training to understand fully. Derek explained that the money came from profits generated by our rental property investments, combined with some successful stock market trades he'd made on Emma's behalf. He said he'd wanted to surprise her with proof that her hard work and talent deserved to be rewarded with financial security. Emma was overwhelmed by the magnitude of Derek's gift, but I found myself studying the paperwork with growing suspicion. The bank statements showed regular deposits over several months, but the account numbers and financial institutions weren't ones I recognized from our own banking relationships. When I asked Derek about the discrepancy, he explained that trust funds required special banking arrangements that were separate from our personal accounts for tax purposes. While Emma called our parents to share the incredible news, I pulled Derek aside to discuss the trust fund privately. Something about the entire situation felt wrong, though I couldn't articulate exactly what was bothering me. Derek's explanations were detailed and seemingly logical, but his body language suggested he was under enormous stress. When I asked how he'd managed to accumulate such a large amount of money without my knowledge, Derek became defensive and accused me of being jealous of Emma's good fortune. The conversation with Derek revealed more troubling information. He admitted that establishing the trust fund had required him to liquidate some of our other investments, including portions of our retirement savings and the equity we'd built in our rental properties. When I expressed concern about jeopardizing our own financial security to benefit Emma, Derek insisted that the moves he'd made were strategically sound and would ultimately benefit all of us. Emma's phone calls to our parents and friends extended throughout the morning, each conversation filled with excitement about her newfound financial freedom. She talked about paying off her student loans, expanding her design business, and maybe even buying her own home. Derek encouraged every ambitious plan she mentioned, offering to help her connect with financial advisors and investment specialists who could help her manage her new wealth responsibly. By afternoon, I developed a splitting headache that had nothing to do with Christmas festivities. Something about Derek's gift to Emma felt fundamentally wrong, like watching someone give away money that didn't belong to them. I decided to conduct my own investigation into the trust fund's origins, starting with the bank statements Derek had included in Emma's gift box. The first red flag was the routing number on the bank statements, which belonged to a financial institution I'd never heard of despite Derek's claims that it was a reputable trust management company. When I called the bank's customer service line, I was told that the account number Emma had been given didn't exist in their system. The customer service representative suggested that I might have copied the numbers incorrectly, but I'd checked them multiple times. Derek's behavior became increasingly erratic as the day progressed. He made several urgent phone calls, speaking in hushed tones about timeline issues, and documentation problems. When Emma asked about the specifics of how she could access her trust fund money, Derek became vague about procedures and suggested they discuss the details after the holidays when the banks reopened. His evasiveness was completely out of character for someone who usually provided excessive detail about financial matters. That evening, while Derek was in the shower, I took photos of all the trust fund documents with my phone and sent them to my college roommate Sarah, who worked as a paralegal at a law firm specializing in estate planning. Sarah's response came back within an hour. The documents looked professionally created but contained several irregularities that suggested they might be fraudulent. She recommended that Emma have the paperwork reviewed by an independent attorney before taking any action based on its contents. The revelation that Derek might have given Emma fake documents created a cascade of horrifying possibilities in my mind. If the trust fund was fraudulent, where had Derek obtained $500,000 worth of convincing paperwork? Why would he create such an elaborate deception for Emma's benefit? And most importantly, what was he hiding about our own financial situation that would drive him to such desperate measures? I spent Christmas night lying awake beside Derek, listening to him toss and turn while muttering incomprehensibly in his sleep. Every few hours, his phone would buzz with text messages that he'd check immediately, his face illuminated by the screen's glow in our dark bedroom. When I asked about the late-night messages, Derek claimed they were automated alerts from his investment accounts, but his explanations sounded rehearsed and hollow. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. Derek's phone rang at 7 a.m., and I could hear a man's angry voice shouting through the speaker even though Derek had moved to the balcony for privacy. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, with Derek's responses becoming increasingly apologetic and desperate. When he returned to our apartment, his face was ashen and his hands were shaking worse than they had been on Christmas morning. Derek's explanation for the phone call was that a business deal had fallen through, creating some temporary cash flow problems that would resolve themselves within a few weeks. He asked me not to mention the situation to Emma since it might worry her unnecessarily about her trust fund. The way he connected the failed business deal to Emma's financial gift sent alarm bells ringing in my mind. That afternoon, I made a decision that would expose the truth about Derek's Christmas generosity and destroy the illusion of financial security he'd built around our marriage. I drove to the address listed on one of our rental property documents, determined to see for myself what investments Derek had made with my inheritance money. The building I found bore no resemblance to the profitable rental property Derek had described. Instead of a renovated apartment complex in a gentrifying neighborhood, I discovered a condemned structure with boarded windows and a city notice declaring it uninhabitable. The property had clearly been abandoned for years, with no signs of the tenants or rental income Derek had been reporting in his monthly financial updates. Standing in front of that derelict building, I realized that Derek had been lying to me about virtually every aspect of our financial life. The rental properties were worthless, the investment profits were fictional, and Emma's trust fund was almost certainly funded by money Derek had stolen from somewhere else. The man I'd married and trusted with my future had constructed an elaborate web of deception that was finally beginning to unravel. I drove home that evening knowing that my marriage was over and that Emma's Christmas gift would soon reveal itself as the cruelest kind of fraud. Derek had no idea that I'd discovered his lies, but his time as the generous benefactor and successful investor was about to come to an end. The eviction papers I would serve him the next morning were just the beginning of the reckoning he'd brought upon himself. The morning after my discovery at the condemned property, I woke up with a clarity that surprised me. Derek was already gone, claiming he had an emergency client meeting that couldn't wait until after the holidays. His absence gave me the opportunity I needed to conduct a thorough investigation of our apartment and the financial documents he'd tried so hard to keep hidden from me. Derek's home office had always been off-limits, supposedly to protect client confidentiality and sensitive business information. But with him gone and my marriage hanging in the balance, I had no qualms about breaking into his private sanctuary. The locked filing cabinet yielded to a hairpin and 15 minutes of determined effort, revealing a treasure trove of documents that painted a devastating picture of Derek's criminal activities. The first folder contained correspondence with someone named Marcus Valdez, apparently Derek's business partner in a sophisticated investment fraud scheme. The emails detailed how they'd been stealing money from Derek's clients at the financial firm, using fake investment accounts to funnel funds into their personal accounts. Derek's role was to identify wealthy clients with large portfolios, while Marcus handled the technical aspects of creating fraudulent documentation and offshore banking arrangements. The second folder was even more damaging. It contained detailed records of how Derek had systematically stolen my inheritance money, my college savings, and even the small emergency fund my parents had given us as a wedding gift. Every dollar I'd trusted him to invest had been diverted into accounts controlled by Derek and Marcus. The rental properties I believed we owned together were either worthless or didn't exist at all. Emma's trust fund documents were revealed to be part of an elaborate exit strategy. Derek and Marcus had been planning to disappear with their stolen funds, but Derek wanted to leave Emma with something substantial before vanishing. The $500,000 in her trust fund wasn't profit from legitimate investments. It was money stolen from Derek's clients, including a retired couple who'd entrusted him with their entire life savings. The most chilling discovery was a detailed timeline showing Derek's planned disappearance. He intended to liquidate all remaining assets by New Year's Eve, transfer the funds to accounts in the Cayman Islands, and leave the country on January 2nd. Emma's trust fund was designed to keep her grateful and unsuspicious until Derek was safely beyond the reach of law enforcement. Once the fraud was discovered, Emma would become an unwitting accomplice, holding stolen money in an account established in her name. Armed with this evidence, I faced an impossible choice. I could expose Derek immediately and watch Emma's dreams crumble along with his freedom, or I could find a way to protect my sister while ensuring Derek faced justice for his crimes. Emma had done nothing wrong except trust the wrong person, and she deserved better than becoming collateral damage in Derek's downfall. My first call was to Sarah, my paralegal friend who'd already identified irregularities in Emma's trust fund documents. I explained the situation in detail, sending her photos of the most damaging evidence I'd found in Derek's files. Sarah's advice was straightforward. Contact the FBI immediately and let them handle both Derek's arrest and the recovery of stolen funds. She warned me that attempting to handle the situation privately could make me an accessory to Derek's crimes. Instead of following Sarah's advice, I decided to confront Derek personally and demand that he voluntarily surrender to authorities while making full restitution to his victims. This approach would give me some control over the timing of his arrest and allow me to prepare Emma for the devastating news about her trust fund. I spent the afternoon preparing for a conversation that would destroy my marriage and shatter my sister's Christmas joy. Derek returned home that evening looking haggard and defeated, as if the weight of his criminal activities was finally becoming unbearable. When I told him we needed to talk about his business partnership with Marcus Valdez, his face went completely white. He tried to deny everything at first, claiming he'd never heard of Marcus. But I showed him printed copies of their email correspondence and watched his resistance crumble. The confession that followed was both pathetic and horrifying. Derek admitted that the investment fraud had started small, with him skimming tiny amounts from client accounts to cover personal expenses. The scheme had escalated when Marcus approached him with a proposal to steal larger sums using sophisticated forgery and offshore banking. Derek claimed he'd planned to return the stolen money eventually, but his gambling addiction had consumed most of their profits and made restitution impossible. Derek's gambling problem was news to me, another secret he'd hidden throughout our entire relationship. He'd been betting on sports, playing online poker, and making increasingly desperate trips to casinos in an attempt to win back the money he'd stolen. Instead of recovering the funds, Derek had lost nearly everything, leaving him with no choice but to plan his escape from the country before his crimes were discovered. The revelation about Emma's trust fund money being stolen from innocent victims made me physically sick. Derek begged me to understand that he'd wanted to give Emma something real and substantial before he disappeared, claiming that his love for my family was genuine even if everything else about our relationship had been built on lies. His attempt to portray theft as generosity was so twisted that I struggled to recognize the man I'd thought I'd married. When I demanded that Derek contact the FBI and arrange to surrender himself, he refused and began making desperate counteroffers. He promised to return Emma's trust fund money to its rightful owners if I would give him 48 hours to liquidate his remaining assets and disappear quietly. Derek claimed that his arrest would destroy Emma's reputation and make her a target for his victim's anger, even though she was completely innocent of his crimes. Derek's manipulation tactics shifted to threats when his pleas failed to convince me. He reminded me that I'd signed documents related to our rental property investments, making me potentially liable as an accomplice to his fraud. He suggested that exposing his crimes would result in both of us facing criminal charges, destroying not only our lives but also bringing shame upon my family. His arguments were desperate and illogical, but they revealed how thoroughly he'd planned to use me as a shield against the consequences of his actions. The conversation lasted until nearly midnight, with Derek alternating between confession, manipulation, and increasingly frantic attempts to negotiate his way out of accountability. When I finally told him that I'd already contacted authorities and that his arrest was inevitable, Derek's facade of control completely collapsed. He broke down sobbing, admitting that he'd known this day would come and that he was almost relieved to stop running from his crimes. That night, I slept in our guest bedroom while Derek packed a suitcase in what he claimed was preparation for turning himself in to authorities. I knew he was actually preparing to run, but I'd already taken steps to prevent his escape. Earlier that evening, I'd contacted Derek's firm and the FBI, providing them with copies of all the evidence I'd discovered. Derek's passport was locked in our apartment's safe, and I'd changed the combination while he was distracted by our confrontation. The next morning brought Derek's final desperate attempt to salvage his freedom. He woke me before dawn, claiming that Marcus had threatened both our lives if Derek didn't deliver additional stolen funds by the end of the week. Derek begged me to help him access our joint accounts so he could pay Marcus and buy time to arrange voluntary surrender to authorities. His story was obviously fabricated, but it revealed the depth of desperation driving his increasingly irrational behavior. Instead of helping Derek access our accounts, I handed him an envelope containing eviction papers I'd prepared during the sleepless hours of the previous night. Since Derek's name wasn't on our apartment lease, another detail he'd manipulated to maintain control over our living situation, I had legal grounds to remove him from the premises immediately. The eviction notice gave Derek 24 hours to vacate our home and remove all his personal belongings. Derek's reaction to the eviction papers was a mixture of shock, anger, and desperate pleading. He couldn't believe I was throwing him out during the holidays, and he accused me of being heartless and vindictive. When I explained that his presence in our home was putting me at legal risk, and that I needed to protect myself from further involvement in his crimes, Derek finally began to understand that his manipulative tactics would no longer work on me. The sound of Derek's phone ringing interrupted our final confrontation, and I could see FBI agent Jennifer Morrison's name displayed on the screen. The call that Derek had been dreading for months had finally arrived, and there was nowhere left for him to run. Derek stared at his phone for a full 10 seconds before answering Agent Morrison's call, his hand trembling so violently I thought he might drop the device. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper as he confirmed his identity and agreed to meet with federal agents at our apartment within the hour. The conversation was brief, professional, and final. There would be no more running, no more lies, and no more chances for Derek to manipulate his way out of the consequences he'd spent months trying to avoid. After ending the call, Derek collapsed onto our couch and buried his face in his hands. The confident, successful man I'd married had completely disappeared, replaced by someone who looked broken and defeated. When he looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, he made one final attempt to justify his actions by claiming that everything he'd done had been motivated by his desire to provide a better life for me and Emma. The explanation was so pathetically self-serving that I felt nothing but disgust for the person I'd once loved. The FBI agents arrived exactly when they'd promised, their presence transforming our luxury apartment into a crime scene. Agent Morrison was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that made Derek shrink further into himself. Her partner, Agent Rodriguez, immediately began photographing Derek's office while Morrison explained the charges Derek would be facing: wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Derek's arrest was surprisingly anticlimactic. He didn't resist or attempt to flee, instead sitting quietly while Agent Rodriguez read him his rights and fitted him with handcuffs. As they led him toward our front door, Derek turned back to look at me one final time, his expression a mixture of regret and desperate hope that I might somehow forgive him. I met his gaze without emotion, feeling nothing but relief that this nightmare was finally ending. Agent Morrison stayed behind to explain the legal procedures that would follow Derek's arrest and the steps I needed to take to protect myself from potential criminal liability. Since I'd contacted authorities immediately upon discovering Derek's crimes and had cooperated fully with their investigation, I wouldn't face charges related to his fraudulent activities. However, I would need to testify at his trial and assist with efforts to recover stolen funds for his victims. The most difficult conversation of my life came next, telling Emma that her Christmas trust fund was built on stolen money and that she would have to surrender every dollar Derek had given her. I drove to Emma's apartment that afternoon, dreading the moment when I would have to destroy her happiness and shatter her faith in the man who'd become her mentor and financial savior. Emma's reaction to Derek's arrest was disbelief followed by devastating heartbreak. She couldn't comprehend how someone who'd been so generous and supportive could simultaneously be a criminal who'd stolen from innocent people. When I explained that her trust fund money belonged to Derek's victims, including a retired couple who'd lost their life savings, Emma immediately insisted on returning every penny, even though doing so would leave her with nothing but debt from the business expenses she'd already incurred. The legal process of returning Emma's trust fund money was complicated by the fact that Derek and Marcus had moved the stolen funds through multiple accounts to obscure their origins. Agent Morrison explained that financial crimes investigations often took months or years to resolve, meaning Emma's money would be frozen indefinitely while prosecutors traced the complete scope of Derek's fraud. Emma would have to close her design business and find other employment while waiting for the legal system to sort through Derek's crimes. Emma's strength during this crisis impressed everyone involved in the case. Rather than wallowing in self-pity or anger, she immediately began cooperating with FBI investigators to help them understand how Derek had manipulated her business relationships and used her design work to legitimize his fraudulent rental property investments. Emma's insights helped investigators discover additional victims and trace stolen funds that might otherwise have remained hidden. The trial preparation process revealed the full extent of Derek's betrayal. He'd stolen nearly $2 million from his clients over 18 months, using sophisticated techniques Marcus had taught him to create false investment statements and forge bank documents. Derek's gambling addiction had consumed most of their profits, leaving victims with worthless paper trails instead of the secure retirements they'd planned for decades. Derek's business partner Marcus was arrested 3 days after Derek, caught attempting to board a flight to Brazil with suitcases full of cash and fake identification documents. Marcus immediately began cooperating with prosecutors, providing detailed testimony about Derek's role in their fraud scheme in exchange for a reduced sentence. His cooperation meant that Derek would face the full weight of federal prosecution without the possibility of shifting blame to his partner. The divorce proceedings began while Derek was in federal custody awaiting trial. Since Derek had systematically stolen and hidden our marital assets, the divorce was largely a matter of legal paperwork rather than property division. I retained ownership of our apartment, which Derek had never actually contributed to purchasing, and I was absolved of responsibility for debts Derek had incurred through his criminal activities. Emma and I grew closer during the months following Derek's arrest, united by our shared experience of being deceived by someone we trusted completely. Emma found work at a marketing firm while slowly rebuilding her freelance design business using legitimate clients and honest business practices. The experience of losing everything she'd thought Derek had given her taught Emma valuable lessons about financial independence and the importance of maintaining control over her own career. The trial itself was a media spectacle that attracted attention from financial news outlets and true crime podcasters. Derek's case became an example of how trusted financial advisors could exploit client relationships to commit sophisticated fraud. Several of Derek's victims testified about the devastating impact his crimes had on their lives, including the retired couple whose entire life savings had funded Emma's fraudulent trust fund. Derek ultimately pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence of 12 years in federal prison and an agreement to cooperate with ongoing investigations into financial crimes at his former firm. His cooperation led to additional arrests and the recovery of some stolen funds, though most victims would never fully recover their losses. Derek's gambling debts had consumed millions of dollars that could never be returned to the people who'd trusted him with their financial futures. 6 months after Derek's sentencing, I received an unexpected letter from him in prison. The letter was filled with apologies and explanations for his behavior, along with desperate pleas for forgiveness and promises that he would spend the rest of his life making amends for his crimes. Derek claimed that losing me had been the worst consequence of his actions, worse even than his imprisonment, and he begged for the chance to prove that the man I'd fallen in love with had been real despite all his lies. I never responded to Derek's letter or any of the dozens that followed over the subsequent months. The man I'd married had never existed. He'd been a carefully constructed facade designed to hide Derek's criminal activities and provide cover for his theft. The real Derek was the person who'd stolen my inheritance, betrayed my trust, and nearly destroyed my sister's life for his own selfish purposes. Emma and I spent Christmas 2024 in a small cabin in Wisconsin, far from the luxury and pretense that had defined the previous year's celebration. We cooked simple meals, exchanged modest gifts we'd purchased with money we'd earned honestly, and talked about building futures based on our own efforts, rather than someone else's generosity. It was the most genuine Christmas either of us had experienced in years. Today, Emma runs a successful design business that she built from nothing after losing everything Derek had given her. She's learned to trust her own judgment about people and opportunities, and she's never again allowed anyone else to control her financial destiny. The experience of being deceived by Derek taught her that independence and self-reliance are more valuable than any trust fund or gift someone else might offer. As for me, I've learned that love without trust is worthless, and that financial dependence makes people vulnerable to manipulation and abuse. Derek's betrayal taught me to value honesty above generosity, and to recognize that someone who truly loves you will never use money as a tool for control. The eviction papers I served Derek that December morning were the first step toward reclaiming my independence and rebuilding my life on my own terms. The man who handed my sister a trust fund on Christmas morning thought he was securing her loyalty and gratitude while covering his escape from justice. Instead, he handed her stolen money that would become evidence of his crimes and the catalyst for his own destruction. Sometimes the most generous gestures hide the most selfish intentions, and the most beautiful gifts come with the highest prices. The months following Derek's arrest transformed my life in ways I never could have anticipated. Living alone in our former luxury apartment felt strange at first, like inhabiting a museum of someone else's life. Every piece of furniture, every carefully chosen decoration reminded me of decisions Derek had made while I'd been living in blissful ignorance of his criminal activities. The space that had once felt like a symbol of our success now felt like evidence of my naivete. Agent Morrison became an unexpected source of support during the investigation phase. She explained that financial crime victims often experienced a unique form of trauma, not just the loss of money or property, but the devastating realization that someone they'd trusted completely had been deceiving them for years. The psychological impact of Derek's betrayal was compounded by my guilt over not recognizing the warning signs that seemed so obvious in retrospect. The investigation into Derek's crimes expanded far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. Marcus Valdez's cooperation with federal prosecutors revealed a network of financial advisors, accountants, and bank employees who'd been facilitating investment fraud across multiple states. Derek and Marcus were small players in a much larger criminal enterprise that had been stealing from clients for nearly a decade. The scope of the operation was staggering: hundreds of victims and tens of millions of dollars in stolen funds. Emma's resilience during this period amazed everyone who knew her. Rather than retreating into depression or anger, She threw herself into helping other victims of financial fraud find resources and support. She started a blog documenting her experience with Derek's deception, sharing practical advice about recognizing financial manipulation and rebuilding after being defrauded. The blog attracted thousands of readers who'd experienced similar betrayals, creating an online community of survivors supporting each other through recovery. The legal process of untangling Derek's financial crimes took nearly 18 months. Forensic accountants traced money through dozens of accounts across multiple countries, following digital trails that Derek and Marcus had tried to obscure through sophisticated money laundering techniques. Every recovered dollar meant the difference between financial ruin and partial recovery for victims who'd trusted Derek with their life savings. My testimony at Derek's trial was emotionally exhausting, but ultimately cathartic. Standing in that federal courtroom, describing how Derek had systematically isolated me from our finances while stealing my inheritance and manipulating my sister, felt like reclaiming my voice after months of silence. Derek sat at the defendant's table looking smaller and more pathetic than I'd ever seen him, occasionally glancing in my direction with expressions that seemed to plead for forgiveness I would never give. The prosecution presented evidence that Derek's gambling addiction had been far worse than he'd initially admitted. Credit card records showed that he'd been betting enormous sums on sports games, poker tournaments, and casino visits, often losing more in a single night than most people earned in a year. His addiction had consumed not only the money he'd stolen from clients, but also legitimate earnings from his job, creating an endless cycle of theft and loss that could only end in exposure and arrest. Emma's testimony was particularly powerful because it illustrated how Derek had used genuine kindness and mentorship to facilitate his criminal activities. She described how Derek had encouraged her artistic ambitions while simultaneously using her design work to create legitimate-looking facades for his fraudulent investment properties. Emma's gratitude and trust had made her an unwitting accomplice in Derek's schemes, a realization that still caused her visible pain months after his arrest. The victims' impact statements were heartbreaking to hear. An elderly couple named Robert and Margaret Chen described how Derek's theft of their retirement savings had forced them to sell their home and move in with their adult children. A single mother named Jennifer Walsh explained that Derek had stolen the college fund she'd been building for her disabled son, destroying years of careful planning and sacrifice. Each story reinforced the human cost of Derek's crimes and the ripple effects of financial fraud on entire families. Derek's sentencing hearing provided closure that I hadn't realized I needed. When given the opportunity to address the court before receiving his sentence, Derek delivered what seemed like a genuine apology for his crimes and their impact on his victims. He acknowledged that his gambling addiction didn't excuse his choices, and that he'd used people's trust as a weapon against them. For the first time since his arrest, Derek seemed to understand the magnitude of harm he'd caused. The judge sentenced Derek to 15 years in federal prison, 3 years longer than the prosecution had recommended. The judge cited Derek's position of trust as a financial advisor and his systematic targeting of vulnerable clients as factors that warranted enhanced punishment. Derek would be eligible for parole after serving 12 years, assuming good behavior and continued cooperation with ongoing investigations into financial crimes. Marcus Valdez received a lighter sentence of 8 years due to his extensive cooperation with prosecutors and his willingness to testify against other members of their criminal network. His cooperation led to additional arrests and the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen funds, though the majority of victims would still never fully recover their losses. The mathematics of financial crime rarely favor the victims. Stolen money that's been gambled away or hidden in offshore accounts simply disappears forever. The civil litigation that followed Derek's criminal trial was even more complex than the federal prosecution. Victims filed lawsuits against Derek, Marcus, their former employer, and various financial institutions that had allegedly failed to detect obvious signs of fraud. Emma and I found ourselves involved in multiple civil cases, sometimes as witnesses and sometimes as defendants, when victims claimed we should have known about Derek's crimes and reported them sooner. The financial recovery process was slow and frustrating. Asset forfeiture proceedings allowed the government to seize Derek's remaining property, including his BMW, his watch collection, and the few legitimate investments he'd made with his salary. The proceeds from these sales were distributed among his victims, but the recovered amounts were typically pennies on the dollar compared to what had been stolen. Most victims received less than 10% of their original losses. Emma's business recovery became a model for how fraud victims could rebuild their lives and careers. She developed new skills in digital marketing and web design, expanding her services beyond the traditional graphic design work that Derek had encouraged. Her client base grew through word-of-mouth referrals and her online presence, proving that she could succeed without the artificial boost Derek's connections had provided. Emma's success was entirely her own, built on talent and determination rather than someone else's criminal generosity. My own career path shifted dramatically after Derek's arrest. The experience of being deceived so thoroughly by someone I'd trusted completely sparked an interest in financial literacy and consumer protection. I enrolled in a graduate program in forensic accounting, determined to develop skills that would help other people recognize and report financial crimes. The irony wasn't lost on me. Derek's betrayal had inadvertently directed me toward a career fighting the same types of crimes he'd committed. The divorce finalization brought unexpected relief rather than sadness. By the time our marriage was legally dissolved, I'd already grieved the loss of the person I'd thought Derek was, and accepted that he'd never actually existed. The man I'd fallen in love with had been a carefully constructed persona designed to hide Derek's criminal activities and provide cover for his theft. Ending our marriage felt like closing a chapter on someone else's life rather than my own. The psychological impact of Derek's betrayal took longer to heal than the practical consequences. Trust issues affected every relationship in my life, from romantic connections to friendships to professional collaborations. I found myself analyzing people's motivations obsessively, looking for signs of deception or manipulation that might indicate hidden agendas. Therapy helped me understand that Derek's betrayal reflected his character flaws rather than my inability to judge people accurately. Emma and I developed a closer relationship during our recovery process than we'd ever had before. Our shared experience of being deceived by Derek created a bond that extended beyond typical sibling affection. We became each other's sounding boards for major decisions, checking each other's judgment about new people and opportunities. Emma's perspective helped me recognize when my paranoia about potential deception was reasonable versus when it was excessive. The media attention surrounding Derek's case was both beneficial and intrusive. Financial news outlets covered the trial extensively, using Derek's crimes as an example of how trusted professionals could exploit client relationships for personal gain. Several victims, including Emma and myself, were interviewed about our experiences with financial fraud and the warning signs other people should watch for. The publicity was uncomfortable, but served a valuable purpose in educating potential victims about financial manipulation tactics. 1 year after Derek's sentencing, I received notification that additional stolen funds had been recovered through international cooperation with banking authorities in the Cayman Islands. My share of the recovery was modest, about $8,000 for my original $35,000 inheritance, but the symbolism was significant. Every dollar recovered represented progress in the long journey toward justice for Derek's victims. Emma's blog about financial fraud recovery evolved into a nonprofit organization that provided resources and support for people who'd been defrauded by trusted advisors, romantic partners, or family members. The organization offered practical guidance about legal options, emotional support through peer counseling, and educational materials about recognizing financial manipulation. Emma's transformation from fraud victim to advocate for other victims demonstrated remarkable strength and resilience. The second Christmas after Derek's arrest marked a turning point in both Emma's recovery and mine. We spent the holiday volunteering at a homeless shelter, serving meals to people who'd lost their homes due to various circumstances, including financial fraud. The experience put our own losses in perspective and reminded us that we'd emerged from Derek's betrayal with our health, our family relationships, and our ability to earn honest livings intact. Emma met someone new that spring, a teacher named Michael Barnes, who appreciated her art and supported her advocacy work without trying to control or influence her career decisions. Michael's financial situation was modest compared to Derek's former lifestyle, but his honesty and respect for Emma's independence made him infinitely more attractive than Derek had ever been. Emma's new relationship demonstrated that she'd learned to value character over wealth and genuine partnership over manipulative generosity. My own romantic life remained on hold while I focused on completing my graduate studies and establishing my forensic accounting career. The skills I was developing in detecting financial crimes felt like armor against future deception, though I recognized that no amount of professional expertise could completely protect against emotional manipulation by someone determined to exploit trust and affection. Derek's letters from prison continued arriving sporadically, each one filled with apologies, explanations, and requests for forgiveness that I never acknowledged. His letters revealed a man trying to rewrite history to cast himself as a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own criminal choices. Derek seemed incapable of accepting full responsibility for his actions, always finding ways to minimize his culpability or blame external factors for his decisions. The final resolution of Derek's case came 3 years after his initial arrest, when the last of his co-conspirators was sentenced and the civil litigation was settled. The total recovery for victims was approximately 30% of their original losses, better than many financial fraud cases, but still devastating for people who'd lost retirement savings and emergency funds they'd spent decades accumulating. The mathematical reality of financial crime is that stolen money is often impossible to recover once it's been spent or hidden. Emma and I marked the anniversary of Derek's arrest, not with sadness, but with gratitude for the lessons we'd learned and the strength we'd discovered. Derek's betrayal had stripped away illusions about love, trust, and financial security, but it had also taught us valuable lessons about independence, resilience, and the importance of maintaining control over our own destinies. The experience had been painful, but ultimately transformative, making us stronger and wiser than we'd been before. Today, Emma runs a successful design business and nonprofit organization that has helped hundreds of financial fraud victims rebuild their lives. She's engaged to Michael, and their relationship is built on mutual respect, shared values, and complete financial transparency. Emma's recovery from Derek's betrayal demonstrates that it's possible to emerge from devastating deception stronger and more self-aware than before. My career in forensic accounting has allowed me to help investigate financial crimes and assist victims in understanding their legal options. The skills Derek's betrayal motivated me to develop have made me an effective advocate for people who've experienced similar deceptions. Every case I work on feels like a small victory against the kind of predatory behavior Derek represented. The man who handed my sister a trust fund on Christmas morning thought he was buying loyalty and silence while covering his escape from justice. Instead, he provided the evidence that would convict him and the motivation that would drive both of us to rebuild our lives stronger than before. Derek's Christmas gift to Emma was built on stolen money and false promises, but our response to his betrayal became the foundation for genuine success and authentic happiness. The eviction papers I served Derek that December morning were just the beginning of a journey toward independence and self-determination that neither Emma nor I could have imagined when we were living under the spell of his manipulative generosity. Sometimes the most painful experiences become the catalysts for the most meaningful growth, and the greatest gifts are the ones we give ourselves through courage, determination, and the refusal to let someone else's betrayal define our futures. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.